The drive back to Crescent Valley took longer than I remembered. 4 hours from Portland, watching the Californian landscape shift from urban sprawl to farmland, then to the smaller roads that wound through wine country. I had the route memorized once. Now it felt foreign, like driving through someone else's nostalgia. The radio played songs I didn't recognize, and I kept switching between stations, unable to settle on anything. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as the familiar landmarks began appearing. The old gas station where Dad used to buy me chocolate milk, the bridge over the dry creek bed, the turnoff to Henderson's farm. Crescent Valley hadn't changed much in 11 years. That was somehow worse than if it had transformed completely. The main street still had the same storefronts, though a few showed signs of age I hadn't noticed as a teenager. The hardware store where my father bought tools for projects he never finished. The courthouse, a pale brick building with columns that looked more impressive in my memory than they did now. I parked my car near the old diner and stepped out into the October afternoon, my professional equipment slung across my shoulder. I was here for work, I reminded myself. Documentary about systemic corruption in rural judicial systems. I was here for the job, not for ghosts. The reunion with faces I hadn't seen in over a decade was surreal. Mrs. Patterson from the library gasped when she recognized me, pulling me into an embrace that smelled like lavender detergent and old friendships. "We heard you were coming," she said, pulling back to study my face. "Hardly recognized you. You're so—" She trailed off, searching for the right word. "Professional," I supplied internally. "Harder. Less the girl who used to help shelve books on Saturday afternoons." We exchanged pleasantries about time flying, about how she remembered my father's kindness, about my mother's health up in Seattle. The conversation had the rhythm of a script, both of us playing our assigned roles. Later, at the courthouse, I met with James Henderson, the clerk I'd spoken with on the phone. He was older than I expected, his hair more gray than I remembered, his face weathered by decades of bureaucratic frustration. We sat in a small office off the main hallway, surrounded by filing cabinets and the smell of old paper. I explained my project carefully, showing him the credentials that would grant access to certain records. He listened, nodding occasionally, but his eyes held a wariness that made me uneasy. "Your father's case," he said finally, leaning back in his chair. "That was a long time ago." 15 years, I corrected. "Still a long time. Things have a way of settling. People move on." He wasn't warning me directly, but the subtext was clear. "Let the dead stay buried." "I'm not here to disturb anything," I said, which was partially true. I'm looking at patterns across multiple jurisdictions, trends in how certain cases are handled. He watched me for a long moment, then slid a file across the desk. "These are public records. You're entitled to review them." He paused. "But I'd be careful about what questions you start asking. There are people in this town who preferred how things settled out back then." "What people?" I pressed. James glanced toward the closed door, then back to me. "Thomas Valence. You probably heard the name. He left town about 8 years ago. Nobody knows exactly where he went, just that he disappeared around the same time certain investigations lost momentum." He lowered his voice. "Your father was looking into operations connected to Valence before the accident." The word hung in the air between us. Accident. That's what the police called it. Single vehicle collision on a wet road. My father hydroplaned, overcorrected, crashed into a ravine. Case closed. I'd been 15 years old, sitting in the school office when Principal Morrison told me, her hands fluttering awkwardly as she struggled to explain how your parent simply ceases to exist. No preparation, no goodbye, just gone. "What kind of operations?" I asked. James stood abruptly, as if standing could end the conversation. "I've said enough. You can review the records, but I can't discuss active or potentially active matters. You understand." He didn't wait for my response. He just opened the door, and I understood my time was up. I spent the rest of the day methodically photographing documents, birth certificates, marriage records, the mundane administrative infrastructure of small-town life. Nothing that directly addressed my father. Nothing that explained James's warning. The courthouse closed at 5, and I drove to the motel on the edge of town, a place that hadn't existed when I left, and still looked new in a way that suggested it wasn't thriving. The woman at the desk recognized me anyway. Small towns have that supernatural ability to track their fugitive children. That evening, I didn't stay in my room. I drove through town, retracing routes I'd traveled as a child. The house where I grew up was still painted blue, though the shade had faded. New people lived there now, their lives unfolding in rooms where I had learned to tie my shoes and failed my first math test. I didn't stop. Driving slowly past felt intrusive enough. I found myself on the old county road that led out of town, away from the main commercial areas, into the territory where land became more valuable for what grew on it than what you could build on it. The cemetery sat on a small rise, surrounded by white fencing that had weathered to the color of old bones. I'd attended my father's funeral here. I'd worn a black dress I never wore again. I'd watched them lower his casket into the ground while my aunt held my hand, and my sister Sarah stood rigid beside us, her face completely blank. Sarah had been 19 then. She'd stayed in Crescent Valley afterward. I'd left as soon as I could. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I could have left it at that, returned to the motel, ordered takeout, reviewed my notes. Instead, I pulled through the gates and drove slowly along the narrow paths. The cemetery was empty of other visitors. I passed headstones marked with names I recognized. Old classmates' grandparents, distant relatives, people who had shaped my childhood in ways I'd forgotten, until seeing their names carved in stone reminded me they'd existed. My father's grave was exactly where I'd left it, under a sprawling oak tree on a small hill that overlooked the valley beyond. The headstone was simple. His name, his birth date, his death date. No epitaph. My mother couldn't decide on one, and by the time she might have come back to add something, she'd moved to Seattle with my aunt and never returned. I parked and walked up the path. The November weather was unpredictable this time of year. The morning had been clear, but clouds had rolled in during the afternoon, and the air smelled like potential rain. My feet crunched on the gravel path. The cemetery was quiet in the way that only sacred spaces could be quiet. There was no sound of traffic from the main road, no breeze through the trees, just a profound absence of the world's noise. That's when I saw him. He was on his knees in front of my father's grave, his back to me, and the shock of seeing a stranger there, a man in an expensive suit soaked with the first drops of rain that had begun to fall, froze me in place. He didn't move when he heard me approaching. His shoulders were broad, his posture one of genuine supplication, not the performative kneeling of someone praying for show. Rain darkened his jacket. Water dripped from his dark hair. And when he finally turned to look at me, the first thing I registered was his eyes. They were brown, catching what light remained in the darkening sky, and they held something that looked like grief. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice was low, accented in a way I couldn't immediately place. Italian heritage, maybe, or mixed ancestry that carried Mediterranean tones. It was the voice of someone accustomed to authority, but right now, it carried only weary resignation. "This is my father's grave," I replied, the statement more defensive than I intended. He stood slowly, brushing dirt from his knees. He was tall, well over 6 feet, and his frame carried the kind of controlled strength that suggested either gym discipline or a life that had required physical capability. A scar would have completed the picture of someone dangerous, but his face, though handsome in a way that could cut, was unmarked. "I know who this is," he said, and the knowing in that statement was the most terrifying thing he could have said. "I knew him. Who are you?" He looked at the grave for a long moment, at the rain that was now falling harder, at the sky that had transformed from beautiful to threatening in the span of minutes. When he finally answered, he gave only a first name, which should have been useless, but somehow felt like the only truth available in that moment. "Giovanni," he said, "and I owe him everything." Then he walked past me, down the hill, and I heard an engine start somewhere beyond my line of sight. I stood alone at my father's grave as the rain intensified, soaking through my jacket, wondering what debt could possibly require a man in an Italian suit to kneel at a dead judge's stone. The diner on Route 9 was half empty when I arrived. Giovanni had called my motel room that morning, voice clipped and businesslike, offering an address and a time. I hadn't asked how he got my number. In a town like Crescent Valley, that information was probably easier to obtain than a decent cup of coffee. I'd agreed to meet him, though I couldn't articulate why I'd said yes, instead of immediately refusing to see a stranger who'd been kneeling at my dead father's grave like it was some kind of shrine. The fluorescent lights inside the diner flickered with the exhaustion of things past their functional lifespan. I'd eaten here as a child, in booths that still bore the same cracked vinyl. The waitress, an older woman whose name tag read Dolores, didn't recognize me or pretended not to. She poured coffee without asking and left me in a corner booth that smelled vaguely of pancakes and regret. Giovanni arrived exactly on time, which told me something about his character. Punctuality in a criminal context, and I'd already intuited from James's warning at the courthouse that this man existed somewhere in that periphery, suggested discipline. He slid into the booth across from me without preamble, his movements economical and precise. Today he wore dark slacks and a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and he looked somehow more dangerous than he had in the cemetery, stripped of the formal suit. More real, more capable of harm. "Thank you for coming," he said, wrapping his hands around the coffee cup Dolores placed before him without asking. He didn't add cream or sugar. "I wasn't certain you would." "I almost didn't," I replied. "I'm not typically in the habit of agreeing to meetings with men I find kneeling at my family's gravesite. Fair assessment." He took a drink, then set the cup down with deliberate care. "I owe you an explanation, or at least as much of one as I can provide. Start with why you were there at all." He was quiet for a moment, studying the coffee like it contained answers. Outside, the parking lot shimmered in the afternoon heat. A truck pulled in, and two men in work clothes climbed out, heading toward the diner. Giovanni waited until they'd passed our booth before he spoke. "Your father saved my life. Not literally, though it's possible he did that too. But he saved the life I might have become, and that matters more than the breathing kind of salvation." He looked at me directly then, and I understood why people probably listened when he spoke. There was something in his presence that commanded attention without demanding it. 15 years ago, when I was 18 years old and profoundly stupid, I was involved in operations that I'm not going to detail for you. Criminal operations. My family had interest in various enterprises that existed outside the law. I was raised to participate in them, trained from childhood the way some families train their sons to take over the family business. Mine just happened to be the kind of business that occasionally involved violence. I waited for him to continue, my coffee cooling in my hands. "Your father was investigating those operations. He had evidence that could have put me away for a very long time. 20 years, probably more given my age and the nature of what we were doing. He had documentation, testimony, and he had the authority to press charges through the federal system." Giovanni paused. "Instead, he offered me a choice." "What kind of choice?" "He said I could either accept prosecution and face the consequences of my actions, or I could walk away completely. Leave my family, cut ties with everyone and everything connected to those operations, and build a legitimate life. He said he believed people could change if they were given the opportunity to do so. He was willing to be the one to provide that opportunity." I leaned back, processing this. That's not how law enforcement typically operates. No, it isn't. Your father wasn't typical. He believed the system was broken in specific ways, and that sometimes bending the rules was the only way to serve actual justice. He thought redemption was possible. Giovanni's expression hardened slightly. Most people in his position would have seen me as a criminal who deserved punishment. He saw me as a kid who'd been trapped by circumstances and raised to believe I had no other options. "So you left," I said, understanding. "I left. I cut contact with my family, with everyone in that world. I spent the next decade building a legitimate business. Import and export, primarily through Portland. It's successful. It's legal. It's boring." A faint smile touched his mouth, there and gone too quickly to fully register. "I owed your father that. The least I could do was prove him right. Then why were you at the cemetery?" I pressed. "Why now?" Giovanni was quiet for a long moment. Outside, clouds had begun gathering again, threatening rain. The light in the diner took on a strange quality, the fluorescent glow suddenly very bright against the darkening sky. Because the debt is never truly repaid, he said finally. I went there to thank him, though I've thanked him 1,000 times in my head over the years. And I went there because I learned recently that someone is investigating your father's death, someone who should be very careful about what they find. The implication hung between us like smoke. The accident wasn't an accident, was it? I said it as a statement, not a question. Giovanni didn't answer immediately. He lifted his coffee cup, drank from it, then set it down with the same careful precision. I don't know that for certain. What I know is that your father was close to exposing something significantly larger than the local operations I was involved with. He was investigating a network that spanned 3 states, possibly more. Human trafficking, money laundering, political corruption. People connected to very significant operations in the criminal world. Who? I demanded. Who was he investigating? A man named Thomas Valence. He operated as a broker between the legitimate world and the criminal one. Politicians would use him to maintain deniability. Criminals would use him to avoid detection. He was the connector, the fulcrum point on which the entire structure balanced. Giovanni leaned forward. Your father was documenting Valence's network. He had names, dates, financial records. He was building a case that would have exposed everything. And Valence couldn't allow that to happen. Neither could the people Valence worked for. Your father died in a single vehicle accident on a wet road, and the investigation into what he'd been pursuing ended the same day he died. The police called it an accident. No suspects. No foul play. Case closed. I felt something cold settle in my chest. You think Valence killed him? I think Valence had your father killed. Whether he pulled the trigger himself or contracted it out, the result is the same. Your father was a threat to an operation that generates millions of dollars annually. He died in what looked like an accident. These things are not coincidental. How do you know this? My voice was steady, which surprised me, because I've spent the last 15 years keeping track of things. Because I owe him a debt that extends beyond my own redemption, and part of honoring that debt is protecting his legacy. And because when I learned that his daughter had returned to town asking questions, I realized that protection might become very necessary. Dolores appeared, offering refills that Giovanni accepted, and I declined. When she left, I realized my hands were shaking. I wrapped them around my coffee cup for stability. Why would anyone care what I'm asking? I asked. It's been 15 years. If Valence thought my father was a threat, why would my questions matter now? Because your father hid something. Insurance, I think he called it. Something that would bring down the entire network if anything happened to him. I never discovered what it was, though I've looked. Giovanni's dark eyes held mine. But the people involved in this operation are still looking. And if they believe you're getting close to finding what your father hid, they'll act. So you came to warn me. I said it sarcastically, but he didn't react. I came to warn you that asking questions in Crescent Valley about your father's death is dangerous. I came to tell you that Thomas Valence disappeared 8 years ago, and nobody knows where he is, but his operations are still running. And I came to tell you that if you insist on pursuing this, you're going to need protection. I stood abruptly, suddenly needing to escape the booth, the diner, the weight of what he was suggesting. This is insane. You're describing a conspiracy that would require incredible coordination across multiple jurisdictions. The police aren't corrupted. The system isn't that broken. Sit down, Giovanni said quietly, and I found myself sitting without consciously deciding to do so. His voice carried a weight that transcended politeness. It was command dressed in courtesy. Your father discovered that specific judges were taking payments to dismiss cases, that specific police officers were being compensated to look away from certain operations, that state prosecutors were selectively choosing which cases to pursue. It's not total corruption. It's systemic corruption. The people involved are careful. They're patient. And they've been running their operation successfully because very few people have ever been foolish enough to try to expose it. Why are you telling me this? I whispered. Because your father believed you deserved to know the truth about who he was and what he died trying to accomplish. Because I owe him everything, and protecting his daughter seems like the most significant way to honor that debt. And because you're going to pursue this regardless of what I say, and I'd rather know you're aware of the danger than surprise you with it later. I didn't respond to that. The implications were too large, too overwhelming. A man I'd never met before was sitting across from me in a small-town diner, claiming my father had been murdered by powerful people who were still operating unchecked in the world. It should have sounded paranoid, delusional. Instead, it aligned too perfectly with the fragments I'd found in my father's papers, with the warning James had given me, with the gaps in the official narrative that had never quite made sense. "What do you want from me?" I finally asked. "Right now?" "Nothing. But keep my number close." He slid a business card across the table. Just a plain white card with embossed lettering. Giovanni Moretti. Import, export, an address in Portland. If you decide to investigate further, call me. If you decide to ask questions you shouldn't ask, call me. If anything feels off or dangerous, call me immediately. The debt I owe your father extends to his children. I picked up the card, feeling its weight. It seemed to matter more than it should. And if I ignore this warning and leave town, then I'll consider my obligation fulfilled and you'll be safe. He stood, leaving cash on the table for both our meals. But you won't leave, because you're your father's daughter, and he couldn't let injustice stand, and neither will you. You're going to stay and ask questions. And the people who benefited from your father's silence are going to become aware that someone is asking them, and that's when you'll call me. He left before I could respond, moving through the diner with the same fluid grace he'd shown in the cemetery. I watched him until he disappeared into the parking lot. Then I looked down at the card in my hand. The letters seemed to shimmer under the diner's fluorescent lights. Giovanni Moretti. A man who owed my father a debt. A man who was offering protection against an enemy I wasn't even certain existed. The waitress appeared, clearing the table, and I realized I was alone with my questions, and a card that represented something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. Outside, the sky had darkened to the color of bruised fruit. Rain was coming. In a town like Crescent Valley, where nothing happened and everything stayed buried, rain seemed entirely appropriate. I pocketed the card and left the diner. The library in Crescent Valley occupied the same modest brick building it had occupied since 1987. I remembered coming here as a child, sitting in the young adult section while my father met with colleagues in the back office. Mrs. Patterson had been running the place then, and she was running it still, though time had etched itself into her face with more definition. She greeted me when I arrived on my 5th day back in town, her expression brightening with genuine pleasure before settling into something more cautious. I'd spent the previous days systematically reviewing public records, court documents from my father's death, property records related to local businesses, news archives from the 15 years preceding his accident, looking for patterns, connections, anything that might illuminate what James had alluded to at the courthouse. The digital archives were limited, but the library maintained microfilm copies of the local newspaper going back decades. I'd spent hours hunched over the microfilm reader, my eyes burning from the strain, watching history unfold in tiny increments. Thomas Valence appeared in those archives with surprising frequency. A ribbon cutting at a new commercial development, a donation announcement from his company, attendance at a mayor's gala, always positioned at the periphery of legitimacy, never quite in the center, but never absent. In most photographs he was a blur, a suited figure in the background. But in one image from 14 years ago, taken at a courthouse fundraiser, he was clearly visible. A man in his early 50s, distinguished-looking, with silver threading through his dark hair, and the kind of controlled expression that suggested practice at not revealing anything. 3 months before my father died, Valence had been photographed with him at the same courthouse fundraiser. They stood on opposite sides of the frame, not together, but documented in the same photograph. 2 men in suits, one of whom was about to die in circumstances that would be labeled accidental. Mrs. Patterson brought me a water bottle without asking. The library was quiet, the way it always was on weekday afternoons, with only a few patrons browsing the limited selection. She settled into the chair across from me at the microfilm station, her face arranged in an expression of concern. "You've been reviewing a lot of history," she observed carefully. "Local history, specifically." "Research for my documentary," I said, which was partially true. "About your father's case?" She asked it gently, but the question itself was an acknowledgement that she understood what I was doing. I set down the microfilm reader control and faced her directly. What do you remember about the accident? The year my father died? Mrs. Patterson took her time answering. Her fingers twisted together in her lap, a nervous gesture that contradicted the calmness of her voice. I remember it was October. The roads were wet. There were questions, certainly, but... She paused, searching for the right words. But those questions were answered relatively quickly. The police investigation concluded it was an accident. Your father was alone in the car. There were no witnesses. The road conditions were poor. Everything pointed to hydroplaning. Everything, I repeated, or only what was thoroughly documented. That's a complicated question. Mrs. Patterson glanced around the library, confirming that no one was close enough to overhear our conversation. Your father was a good man. Fair. The kind of judge who believed the law meant something real. But that made him unpopular in certain circles. Thomas Valence, I said directly. Her face went very still. I would be very careful about saying that name too loudly around here. Why? He's gone. Nobody knows where he is. He's gone from Crescent Valley, Mrs. Patterson corrected. That's not the same as gone from influence. Men like that don't simply vanish. They relocate their operations and maintain their networks through distance. And people in this town have long memories about who helped them and who threatened them. I leaned forward. James at the courthouse implied that my father was investigating Valence, that the investigation stopped when my father died. Mrs. Patterson's jaw tightened. She stood abruptly, gesturing for me to follow her. We moved through the library toward the back office, a small room filled with filing systems and administrative clutter. She closed the door behind us before speaking again. Your father came to me 3 weeks before he died. He wanted to access certain records that weren't in the public system. Property deeds, business registrations, that sort of thing. I helped him. She sat behind her desk, and I realized how much older she looked in this private space, how much the public facade cost her. He was documenting something large enough that he was frightened, though he tried to hide it. He said if anything ever happened to him, I should ensure certain information reached you when you were old enough to understand it. What information? What did he want you to tell me? He said Thomas Valence was connected to operations that extended far beyond Crescent Valley. Human trafficking, he mentioned. Money laundering. Corruption in multiple judicial systems across 3 states. He said he had evidence, but that the evidence wasn't safe with him. Wasn't safe anywhere obvious. He said he was afraid that if he went to the authorities, the evidence would disappear. Mrs. Patterson opened a desk drawer and withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. He gave me this. Said to give it to you if I ever saw you again, looking for answers about his death. I took the envelope with trembling hands. My name was written on the front in my father's handwriting, a script I hadn't seen in 15 years, but recognized instantly. I didn't know you were coming back, Mrs. Patterson continued. I didn't know if you ever would, but when I heard you were in town, I thought perhaps now was the time to deliver this. I looked at the envelope, then at her. Why didn't you contact me before? Why not send this to my mother or my sister? Because your father said to give it to you personally, and only when you came looking for answers about his death. He believed that if you were curious enough to ask questions, you would be ready to know the truth. She folded her hands again. He also said to tell you that what happened to him was not an accident. He knew the risks he was taking. He knew there were people who would want to silence him. But he believed some truths were worth dying for. I opened the envelope right there, my hands shaking so badly I nearly tore it. Inside was a handwritten letter, 10 pages of my father's careful script, detailing his investigation into Thomas Valence and the network he controlled. Names, dates, accusations that seemed too large for a single notebook to contain. He wrote about political corruption at the state level, about judges being paid to dismiss cases, about police officers being compensated to overlook certain criminal enterprises. He wrote about human trafficking operations running along interstate corridors, about victims being transported without anyone of consequence noticing or caring. And he wrote about his conviction that the only way to stop it was to expose the entire structure at once, to make it impossible for the corruption to survive public scrutiny. At the end of the letter, he wrote, "If you're reading this, I'm likely dead. I've taken precautions. But the people I'm investigating are patient and thorough. I've hidden my insurance in a place I believe is safe. I have backup documentation, financial records, testimony from victims. When you're ready to know where this is, you'll understand. Trust your instincts. Trust your gut. And please know that I'm sorry for the weight this places on you. I'm sorry that being my daughter now comes with danger. I love you. I'm so proud of the woman you're becoming. Use this information to finish what I started. I couldn't read past that. Mrs. Patterson offered me tissues, and I realized I was crying. 15 years of compartmentalized grief suddenly had structure and context and purpose. My father hadn't simply died in an accident. He'd been murdered for asking questions that threatened powerful people, and he'd prepared for that possibility by documenting everything and hiding it somewhere he believed I would eventually find. There's more, Mrs. Patterson said quietly. A USB drive. Your father gave it to me at the same time as the letter. It contains digital copies of his investigation. Financial records, photographs, surveillance documentation. He said if you were to understand the scope of what he'd discovered, you would need technical evidence in addition to his narrative. She produced a small USB drive from the same drawer, handling it like it was radioactive. I took it and held both items, the letter and the drive, understanding that I was now in possession of something that had cost my father his life, and that the people responsible for his death would very much like to recover. You need to be careful, Mrs. Patterson said. This town has moved on from your father's death. Most people have accepted the official narrative because accepting anything else would require action they're not willing to take. But that doesn't mean the people behind his death have forgotten. They simply moved on to other places, other operations. If you start publicizing what's in that letter and that drive, you'll be drawing their attention back to Crescent Valley. You'll be reminding them that the threat your father posed hasn't actually disappeared. Then I need to be smart about this, I said. I need to verify everything before I publish anything. I need to build a case so airtight that they can't simply dismiss it as the ramblings of a vengeful daughter. And you need protection, Mrs. Patterson added. I would suggest contacting that man who came to see you, the one who knew your father. I stared at her. How did you know about Giovanni? Because he called me, asking about your whereabouts, asking if I'd seen you in town. He seemed concerned about your safety. I suggested you might visit the library. Mrs. Patterson smiled faintly. I've been in town a very long time. I know who the dangerous people are and who the protective ones are. That man falls into the latter category, whatever else he might be. I left the library in a daze, the USB drive and letter secured in my bag, my mind churning through implications and questions. The afternoon had turned cool, autumn asserting itself with the kind of crisp air that makes you remember you're mortal. I drove aimlessly through town, past familiar landmarks, past the places where my childhood had occurred. Then I found myself parked outside a house I hadn't intended to visit. Sarah answered the door after the third knock. My sister, now 34 years old, her blonde hair cut short, her face carrying the kind of weariness that suggested she'd been carrying things too heavy for one person alone. She didn't smile when she saw me. She simply stood in the doorway, wearing jeans and a cardigan, looking at her sister like she was trying to place her. Hi, I said, which was inadequate, but everything else seemed too large for the moment. I heard you were in town, Sarah said. I wasn't sure if you'd bother visiting. Can I come in? She considered this, then stepped aside. The interior of her house was modest, comfortable, decorated with careful attention to creating a space that felt like refuge. I recognized some furniture from our childhood, pieces our mother had left behind when she moved to Seattle. Seeing them in Sarah's house hit me harder than I expected. I'd assumed our connection to those objects had dissolved when we scattered to different parts of the country. Apparently, Sarah had other ideas. I'm sorry, I said, standing in her living room, holding the strap of my bag like it was a lifeline. I'm sorry I left and didn't come back. I'm sorry I wasn't here for you after Dad died. Sarah moved to the kitchen and began brewing tea, a domestic gesture that felt like both acceptance and distance. I don't need an apology that's 15 years late, she said quietly. I need to understand why you're really back. James called me. He said you were asking questions about Dad's death. He said you seemed determined to resurrect things that this town had put to rest, because it wasn't an accident. I said. Dad didn't just hydroplane on a wet road. He was killed because of an investigation he was conducting. Sarah turned to face me, and I saw anger flicker across her features. Everyone in this town accepted what happened. The police said it was an accident. Mom accepted it. I accepted it. We moved on because the alternative was living in conspiracy theories and bitterness. It's not a theory, I said. And I told her about Giovanni, about what he'd revealed, about the letter and the USB drive. I told her about Thomas Valence and the network of corruption my father had discovered. I told her about the insurance my father had hidden. By the time I finished, Sarah was sitting at her kitchen table, her tea forgotten, her expression complicated and wounded and angry all at once. You're going to pursue this, she said. It wasn't a question. I have to. He was our father. He was my father. And he left me alone in this house for 17 years because of whatever he was investigating. Sarah's voice was sharp, cutting. You left too. You went to Portland. You became a journalist. You built a life away from here. But I stayed. I taught at the high school. I became part of this community. I accepted his death because accepting it meant I could stay. Now you come back wanting to dig up the past, wanting to expose the people responsible, as if that will somehow change what happened or bring him back. I'm not trying to bring him back, I said carefully. I'm trying to honor what he died attempting to accomplish. You're trying to solve your own guilt, Sarah shot back. You're trying to make his death meaningful because you weren't here for him, and now you need it to matter. But it does matter. His absence mattered every day I was here alone. The accusation stung because it contained truth. I had left. I had built a life far from Crescent Valley, far from the grief and the complications and the weight of being a judge's daughter in a small town. I had abandoned my sister and my family's memory, and now I was returning, wanting to resurrect it all. Help me, I said finally. Don't approve of what I'm doing necessarily, but help me. Because if Dad was right, if there's a network of corruption still operating, then we owe it to him and to everyone he was trying to protect. Sarah looked away, her jaw tight. I can't, she whispered. I can't go back there. It hurts too much. I wanted to argue with her, to convince her, to make her understand. Instead, I simply nodded and left. She walked me to the door, and we stood in the threshold, two sisters separated by geography and loss, and the different ways we'd learned to survive our father's death. Be careful, Sarah said quietly as I stepped outside. If what you're saying is true, if there are people who actually killed him, they won't want you asking questions. I know, I replied. And if you die doing this, I don't know how I'll forgive you for leaving me behind again. I drove back to Portland that night instead of staying in the motel. I needed space to process what Mrs. Patterson had given me, what Sarah had said, what I now knew about my father's final days. The drive took 4 hours, and I spent them constructing a plan. I would analyze the USB drive. I would cross-reference the documentation my father had compiled with public records and journalistic databases. I would build a framework of evidence that was so comprehensive that no one could dismiss it as speculation. And I would do all of this carefully, without alerting the people who had murdered my father that their secret was being exposed. I had Giovanni's business card. I knew that if I truly was in danger, I could contact him. But I wasn't ready for that yet. I wasn't ready to admit that I needed protection, or that I'd moved beyond the safe realm of journalism into something more dangerous and personal. I would prove myself first. I would build my case, and only when I was absolutely certain of what I'd found would I decide what to do with it. The GPS guided me north toward Portland as the October sky darkened to black. Behind me, Crescent Valley receded into memory and shadow. Ahead of me, the investigation that my father had started 15 years ago was waiting to be completed. The safe house sat in the mountains north of Portland, accessed by a private drive that wound through dense forest. Giovanni hadn't told me exactly where we were going when he'd picked me up 3 days ago, just that it wasn't safe to be in the city anymore. The property sprawled across several acres, all glass and stone built into the hillside like it belonged there organically. Security cameras were positioned at regular intervals, though I tried not to think about the implications of that level of surveillance infrastructure. Inside, the space was comfortable, but clearly utilitarian. A kitchen that could feed a small army. Multiple bedrooms, a common area with high-backed furniture arranged in conversational clusters, a library with floor-to-ceiling books that nobody seemed to read. Giovanni had set me up in a guest room with a view of the valley below. The bed was king-sized with expensive sheets. The bathroom had heated tile floors. It was refuge dressed as luxury, and I understood that distinction immediately. The incident at Giovanni's Portland office had happened quickly and quietly. I'd been there for 3 hours, reviewing his archives, cross-referencing his documentation against my father's research. We were beginning to see the framework of the network. Financial transfers moving between shell companies, political donations that appeared to buy specific judicial outcomes, names connected across multiple jurisdictions. The picture was becoming clear, and clarity was dangerous. The alert came from his head of security, a man named Ryan Foster who seemed to consist entirely of competence and quiet efficiency. 2 men in the parking garage, he'd reported, his voice carrying through Giovanni's office via an earpiece, matching the surveillance profile we discussed. Profile? I'd asked. The one matching known associates of Valence's operation, Giovanni had said grimly, already moving toward his desk to retrieve something from a drawer. They're not local talent. They're professionals. What do they want? You, most likely. Or at minimum, to determine your location. He'd produced a handgun with the kind of casual familiarity that reminded me exactly what Giovanni was, regardless of how successfully he'd legitimized his life. Ryan will get you out. I'll handle the complication. Handle it how? I'd asked, even though I didn't want to know the answer. By ensuring they don't follow, he'd said simply. Go with Ryan. Don't look back. Don't stop driving until you reach the coordinates he gives you. That had been 3 days ago. Now I was in a mountain refuge, ostensibly safe, but feeling anything except secure. Giovanni had arrived the next morning, unharmed, with the kind of casual assurance that suggested confrontation and threat were simply operational expenses for him. He hadn't discussed what happened in the parking garage. I hadn't asked. The kitchen was where I found him on my 4th morning, standing at the counter with his shirt unbuttoned, revealing the kind of physiology that suggested either a rigorous gym regimen or a life that required physical capability. But it was the bruising across his ribs that caught my attention, vivid purple and yellow that suggested recent impact. You were hurt, I said from the doorway. He looked up, seeming unsurprised to find me there. He began buttoning his shirt with economical movements. Nothing significant. The conversation in the parking garage became physical, but I was prepared for that possibility. Did you hurt them? I asked carefully. I did what was necessary to ensure they didn't follow us and couldn't report back on our location. He didn't elaborate, and I understood that I didn't want elaboration. There was a line between knowing Giovanni and understanding Giovanni, and that line ran precisely through the area marked by violence and pragmatism. How long am I staying here? I asked instead. Until it's safe for you to be elsewhere. That depends on how quickly we can determine exactly what Valence is planning, and how much immediate threat he perceives from your investigation. Giovanni poured coffee with steady hands. Your father's documentation is comprehensive. More comprehensive than anything I've managed to compile. Combined with my research, we're looking at a network that's considerably larger than I initially realized. How large? At least 6 states. Possibly more if we're counting the operations that use Valence's network without direct connection to him. He handed me a cup. Your father documented human trafficking operations running from the Mexican border up through California, Oregon, and Washington. Money laundering through legitimate businesses. Judicial corruption ensuring that anyone who gets arrested is either immediately released or served minimal sentences. It's systematic. It's professional. And it generates millions of dollars annually. I sat at the kitchen counter, trying to process the scope of what I was hearing. Can we go public with this? Can we expose all of it at once? We could, Giovanni said carefully. But there are complications. First, the evidence your father compiled is technically evidence he obtained through unofficial channels. Some of it wouldn't be admissible in court. Second, exposing the network means identifying specific people in positions of authority, which opens us to defamation claims if any information is inaccurate. Third, and most important, revealing what we know alerts the people involved that they've been exposed, which means they'll immediately begin destroying evidence and dispersing operations. So we do nothing? I asked, frustrated. We just sit here while they continue operating? No, Giovanni said. We do this carefully. We verify everything. We contact people who can act on this information officially. We build a case that's airtight before we make any public moves. He set his coffee cup down and looked at me directly. Your father tried to do this quickly. He wanted to expose everything at once, believed that a comprehensive assault on the network was the only way to bring it down. But comprehensive is also complicated, and complicated gives people time to prepare responses. Or kills them, I said bitterly. Comprehensive is what got my father killed. Giovanni didn't argue with that. We sat in silence for a moment, the morning light streaming through the kitchen windows, the mountains visible in the distance like everything was normal and peaceful. Tell me about your sister, Giovanni said abruptly. You mentioned her tension, but I need more than that. I explained about Sarah, about the years between her 18th and 34 when she'd stayed in Crescent Valley while I left. I described her resentment, her conviction that I'd abandoned our father's memory, her terror at being drawn into this investigation. She's vulnerable, Giovanni said, which was exactly the conclusion I'd been dreading. If anyone determines that you have a direct connection to this town, they'll look at who you're connected to. Your sister is the most obvious leverage. Then I need to ensure she's protected, I said. You need to ensure she's secure and warned, Giovanni corrected. I'll arrange for someone to be near her, not obviously protecting her, but present. If anyone approaches with intent, she'll have assistance extracting from the situation. I need to call her, I said, standing abruptly. I need to tell her she's in danger. You need to call her carefully, Giovanni said. Because if anyone is monitoring her communications, alerting her to danger could trigger exactly the response we're trying to prevent. He stood as well, moving to the window that overlooked the valley. She needs to be warned, but the warning needs to seem casual. Sisterly concern, not urgent intelligence. I called Sarah from the kitchen phone, my heart hammering as it rang. She answered on the third ring, her voice cautious as she greeted me. I just wanted to check in, I said, trying to sound natural. See how you're doing. I'm fine, Sarah replied, and the lie was obvious in its economy. She was not fine. She was afraid. Work okay? I asked, continuing the pretense of normalcy. Fine. The students have been exhausting, but that's nothing new. She paused. Are you okay? You sound strange. I'm just thinking about Dad, I said, choosing my words carefully. I'm thinking about how he'd want us to look after ourselves. To be careful about who we trust and where we go, and who we let know our whereabouts. Another pause. Longer this time. What's happened? Sarah asked quietly. Nothing yet, but I've been asking questions. And questions have consequences. I think it would be good if you varied your routine. Different routes to work. Maybe spending some nights away from the house. You're scaring me, Sarah said, and I could hear the genuine fear beneath the words. I know. I'm sorry, but this is important. Can you do this? Can you be careful? Sarah said she would, and I ended the call feeling like I'd somehow made everything worse. I'd alerted her to danger without providing context or comfort, and now she was afraid in isolation, trying to process threats she couldn't fully understand. Giovanni watched me hang up the phone. She knows enough to be cautious, he said. That may be all we can do for her right now. The next week unfolded in controlled investigation. We worked through the documentation, Giovanni making periodic phone calls that suggested he was coordinating something with people I didn't meet. I began researching Thomas Valence more directly, using journalistic databases and public records to build a comprehensive profile of the man who'd destroyed my father. Valence had been born in Sacramento, the son of a businessman with vague connections to organized crime from the previous generation. He'd studied law, briefly practiced, then shifted into consulting work that was never clearly defined in any professional directory. He'd accumulated wealth gradually, investing in real estate that was always profitable, but never obviously valuable. He'd donated to political campaigns across party lines, the kind of donor who was hedging all bets. And approximately 8 years ago, he'd liquidated several assets and disappeared from public record. He didn't actually disappear, Giovanni said when I presented my findings. He relocated his operations, changed his name, or started operating through proxies. Men like Valance have practiced the art of invisibility for decades. Going dark is just another operational shift for them. So he's still operating, I said. Still running the network. Still profiting from human trafficking. Almost certainly. The kind of money he was generating doesn't simply evaporate. The infrastructure he built doesn't collapse because one operator leaves the public eye. The system continues because systems are self-perpetuating. On the morning of the 10th day at the safe house, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up instead of letting it go to voicemail. Miss Collins? A male voice I didn't recognize. This is regarding your sister, Sarah Collins, of Crescent Valley, California. We have her. We'll return her unharmed if you cease your investigation into Thomas Valance and his associates. You have 24 hours to make this decision. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my mind refusing to process what I'd just heard. Giovanni appeared in the doorway, and one look at my face told him something had gone catastrophically wrong. Who was that? He demanded. I repeated what the voice had said, watching Giovanni's expression transform into something cold and focused. He immediately moved to a laptop, pulling up surveillance feeds. Multiple screens flickered to life, showing various angles of the safe house, the surrounding property, the road leading in. They've known about Sarah from the beginning, he said, with lethal certainty. They've been waiting for us to make contact. They monitored the call you made to her a week ago, and they've been establishing a position ever since. He picked up a phone and spoke rapidly to someone named Ryan. Secure detail at Crescent Valley. Full protection. Sarah Collins. Go now. He hung up and looked at me. They took her 4 hours ago from her school. She was left with a message to contact you. My people are extracting her now, but we need to move. He was already moving toward the back of the house. Pack what you can carry. Leave everything else. We're not staying here anymore. Where are we going? I asked, following him. Somewhere that changes the entire situation, he said grimly. Somewhere that turns this from a rescue operation into a counterstrike. The warehouse sat 40 minutes from Portland, positioned in the industrial zone near the Columbia River. It was the kind of location that nobody noticed unless they were specifically looking for it. Giovanni had driven us here in silence after extracting Sarah from the location where she'd been held. She was currently being evaluated by a medical team in an adjacent facility, traumatized but physically unharmed. That distinction seemed to matter significantly to Giovanni, as if surviving without additional injury somehow offset the violation of being taken. The operation required 10 days of preparation. Giovanni had resources I hadn't previously considered. Men trained in tactical operations, intelligence analysts, security specialists, technical experts who could access information systems without authorization. The warehouse became a coordination point for something that started resembling a military campaign against Thomas Valance's network. Special Agent Rebecca Torres had entered our operation by accident. She'd been investigating missing persons cases connected to trafficking networks when she'd cross-referenced information from my father's documentation against her own case files. The overlap was significant enough that she'd contacted Giovanni directly, introducing herself as someone with federal authority, who was also someone who'd been personally affected by Valance's operations. Her brother had disappeared 5 years ago, presumed victim of the trafficking network, and the investigation had been systematically obstructed at every turn. Torres was a professional woman in her early 40s, with dark eyes that held a particular intensity born from personal loss. She sat across from Giovanni and myself in a secure meeting room at the warehouse, reviewing intelligence summaries and discussing operational parameters. The FBI can't move on this directly, Torres explained, her voice carrying the frustration of someone who'd fought the system and lost repeatedly. The corruption runs too deep into the Bureau itself. Anyone I bring this to will immediately report back to people inside the network. It has to be approached from outside, and then when we have something absolutely airtight, we go public and federal authorities move simultaneously. How do we make it airtight? I asked. My father couldn't do it. He died trying, because he was alone, Torres said. He had documentation, but he was one agent working against a system that was actively working against him. You have multiple resources. You have Giovanni's intelligence network. You have my access to federal databases. You have his documentation. She gestured at the files spread across the conference table. Combined, it's comprehensive. Separately, it's circumstantial. Giovanni had been quiet through most of this exchange, but now he leaned forward. What I have to provide comes with cost, he said directly. Some of my information comes from sources that won't testify officially. Some of it was obtained through channels that wouldn't survive legal scrutiny. Torres, if we provide this material to federal authorities, I'm effectively incriminating myself. I know, Torres replied, which is why I'm going to ask you to provide immunity cooperation. You provide everything you have on Valence's operations. You cooperate fully with federal investigation, and in exchange, federal prosecutors reduce charges against you for any historical involvement in criminal enterprises. Giovanni and I exchanged looks. He'd already acknowledged that his business had operated in gray areas, that his connections to criminal networks weren't entirely severed. Going into agreement with federal authorities meant exposure, legal liability, possible imprisonment despite cooperation. They'll kill me, I said suddenly. If we move forward with this, if they understand that we're going public, they'll eliminate the threat. That's why we do this simultaneously, Torres said. 3 locations targeted at once. 3 simultaneous arrests with federal backup. Valence at his primary operation hub, his principal lieutenants at 2 secondary locations. Once the primary targets are in custody, once the physical locations are under federal control, they can't retaliate without immediately confirming their criminal status. That assumes your people are actually trustworthy, Giovanni said. That assumes nobody in federal law enforcement is already compromised. That's why I'm involving only people I've personally vetted, Torres replied. Agents from outside this district, prosecutors from the federal office in Seattle, coordination through the DEA because trafficking has drug network connections. It's compartmentalized, which means any leak only exposes that particular compartment. The planning that followed occupied an entire week. Giovanni's analysts compiled financial records documenting money flows through shell companies, creating a traceable path from trafficking victims to accounts owned or controlled by Valence's associates. Torres coordinated with federal agencies, establishing legal frameworks for simultaneous raids. I worked on documentation of the human trafficking itself, gathering victim testimony that Torres had access to through federal victim services, creating a narrative that would be impossible to dismiss as abstract financial manipulation. My role shifted during this period. I moved from investigator to something more active. I coordinated media outreach, giving carefully vetted journalists copies of the documentation under embargo, ensuring that when the raids happened, publication would follow within hours, making it impossible for anyone to suppress the information or control the narrative. Sarah was brought to the warehouse on day 8. She'd recovered from immediate trauma, but remained cautious and angry in ways that were completely justified. She understood that her kidnapping had been leverage, that she'd been taken to compel me into silence. She also understood that she was now part of an operation that would draw her even more completely into the consequences of my investigation. I want to do something, Sarah said to me in the break room, away from Giovanni and Torres and the various personnel moving through the warehouse. I can't just be protected. I can't just wait. I need to be part of this. It's dangerous, I said, which was obvious and unhelpful. It's already dangerous, Sarah replied. They already took me. Hiding doesn't change that. But doing something about it might. She looked at me with an expression that reminded me why I'd left Crescent Valley and why I'd never managed to fully separate from it. Dad tried to do this alone. You tried to do this with just Giovanni. Maybe we do better together. Sarah's role became supporting my documentation efforts, helping to compile victim testimony into narrative form. It was work that required emotional resilience and attention to detail, both of which she possessed in abundance, and it gave her a sense of agency that seemed to help her process the trauma of being kidnapped. The operational timeline was set for day 10. 3 simultaneous raids across different jurisdictions. Federal teams moving in controlled fashion, arresting identified targets, securing physical evidence, press releases prepared, media access coordinated for immediate publication. Everything hinged on execution, on every element moving in perfect synchronization. Giovanni had positioned himself as the central coordination point, which meant his exposure was greatest. He would be arrestable immediately after the operation, his cooperation papers filed, and his fate handed over to federal prosecutors. But before that moment, he needed to be fully operational. The night before the raids, I found him on the warehouse roof, standing at the edge and looking out over the industrial landscape toward the city in the distance. The city where my father had investigated, where Thomas Valence had operated, where the network had systematically corrupted the justice system. "Are you ready for this?" I asked. "No," Giovanni replied simply. "I'm accepting it as necessary, but I'm not ready." He turned to face me. "Your father believed that some truths were worth dying for. I've spent 15 years proving he was right by surviving. Tomorrow, I'll be choosing to stop surviving and start being active. There's a difference." "You won't die," I said, which we both knew was false comfort. "Maybe not physically, but the life I've built, the business I've constructed, the distance I've created from my family's crimes, all of that ends tomorrow." He looked back toward the city. "It ends because it should. Because you can't half commit to redemption. You can't claim to believe in justice while protecting criminal enterprises through distance and silence. My father would have appreciated knowing you," I said. "I know," Giovanni replied. "That's partly why I'm here. Not entirely, but significantly." He turned back to me, and in the darkness, I could barely see his features. "I'm doing this because owing him a debt is one thing, but I'm doing it because you remind me of him, because you're asking questions about corruption instead of accepting comfortable lies, because you're willing to risk everything for truth." "I'm terrified," I admitted. "That's precisely why you're qualified for this," Giovanni said. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is fear and action simultaneously." The raids occurred at precisely 6 a.m. across 3 states. Federal teams moved with coordinated precision. Valence was taken at a property in Central Oregon, where he'd been operating under an assumed identity for the past 8 years. His primary lieutenants were arrested in Portland and Seattle. Within 6 hours, federal prosecutors had filed charges. Within 8 hours, the first articles began publishing. The story broke across national news within 12 hours. 15 years of systematic corruption exposed in a coordinated assault of journalism and federal action. Names of judges, police officers, political figures all documented and publicly identified. Financial flows traced and publicized. Human trafficking victims brought forward with testimony and documentation. The network that my father had attempted to expose and died trying was finally being dismantled. Giovanni was arrested simultaneously with Valence, though not in Valence's presence. Federal agents took him into custody at the warehouse and transported him to a federal detention facility pending processing. He'd provided complete cooperation, and the paperwork filed by Torres resulted in significantly reduced charges, but there were still legal processes to navigate. I watched him being led away, his hands not cuffed, his posture composed. He looked back once, meeting my eyes, and in that moment, something shifted between us. We'd begun this journey with him offering protection, out of debt to my father. Somewhere along the way, it had become something more complicated and personal and real. The operation continued for weeks after the initial raids. Federal investigators worked through the documentation that Giovanni and my father had compiled, verifying information, prosecuting cases, dismantling the infrastructure that Valence had spent decades building. Victims came forward, their testimony providing additional context and detail. The scope of the network became increasingly apparent as each layer was exposed. Sarah and I worked with federal authorities during this period, providing context to our investigation and supporting federal prosecutors as they built cases. It was exhausting work that required constant engagement with material that was depressing and infuriating. We'd take breaks by going back to Crescent Valley, walking through the town that had been built partially on corruption, understanding how our father's death had been both tragedy and logical consequence. Thomas Valence was convicted of conspiracy, human trafficking, money laundering, and murder. The conviction for my father's death came based on documentary evidence that Giovanni had compiled, testimony that connected Valence to the operation, and financial records proving motive. He received a sentence of life without parole, his decades of careful operation culminating in federal imprisonment. Marcus Colton, the man who'd personally ordered my father's execution all those years ago, was arrested based on cell phone records and testimony from other organization members. He'd survived for 8 years by maintaining operational distance and careful anonymity. But federal investigators identified him through communication patterns and financial tracking. His prosecution moved quickly, his crimes adequately documented and corroborated. Giovanni pled to charges of criminal association and money laundering based on his continued involvement with organizational remnants of his family's enterprises. His cooperation resulted in a sentence of 2 years and 8 months in federal prison, a relatively light sentence given the scope of what he'd been involved with. Federal prosecutors understood that his assistance had been instrumental in dismantling a network that had operated with impunity for decades. The night before he began his sentence, Giovanni and I met in a neutral location, a coffee shop in downtown Portland that neither of us had connection to. We sat across from each other, surrounded by people living ordinary lives, completely unaware of the circumstances that had brought us together. "Thank you," I said, which was inadequate, but everything else seemed too large. "For what?" Giovanni asked. "For honoring my father, for helping me finish what he started, for being willing to sacrifice your freedom to make it right." Giovanni was quiet for a moment. "Your father gave me the opportunity to become a different person than I was raised to be. I spent 15 years trying to prove he was right. I'm spending the next 2 years and 8 months fully committing to that proof. When I get out, we'll figure out what comes next." "I don't know what comes next," I said honestly. "Neither do I," Giovanni replied. "But that's part of what makes it real." The coffee shop was warm and ordinary, and so completely disconnected from everything that had led to this moment. Outside, Portland went about its business, unaware that one small conversation was determining the trajectory of 2 people's lives. Giovanni reached across the table and took my hand, and we sat like that until it was time for him to go. 6 months after Giovanni began his federal sentence, I received a letter from the federal prison facility in Sheridan, Oregon. His handwriting was the same as it had always been, controlled and precise, but the words carried the weight of time spent in confinement. He wrote about the routine of prison life, about the other inmates, about the reading he was doing. He wrote about how he thought of the work we'd done, how he believed it mattered despite the cost. He asked about Sarah, about my documentary project, about whether I'd managed to move forward with my life, or whether I was still processing the complexities that had brought us together. I visited him the following week. Federal prison visiting allowed certain hours on specific days, and I'd arranged my schedule around these constraints. The facility itself was surprisingly functional rather than oppressive. Minimum security facilities have a different character than their higher security counterparts. Still a prison, still a place of confinement, but one where people could at least maintain dignity. Giovanni looked different in the prison uniform. The expensive clothes that had defined his aesthetic were gone, replaced by standardized institutional attire, but his bearing remained unchanged. He stood when I entered the visitation area, and we sat across from each other at a small table, our conversation monitored but private in the way that prison visits were private. "You came," he said, which was obvious and somehow still significant. "You asked me to," I replied. I wasn't sure if that was permission or requirement or just statement. "It was hope," Giovanni said simply. "I wasn't certain you'd want to see me once I was placed here. People often prefer their connections to remain successful rather than incarcerated. I'm not people," I said, "and your imprisonment was choice. You made it consciously, and you made it for reasons that matter." We talked for the duration of the visiting window. I told him about the documentary that had eventually been released, the critical reception it had received, the impact it was having on conversations about systemic corruption in judicial systems. I told him about Sarah, about how her recovery from trauma was proceeding in fits and starts, about how we'd begun rebuilding our relationship now that we had shared understanding of what our father had died attempting. Giovanni told me about prison life and the way that people do when they're living in circumstances they've accepted as temporary consequence. He was being treated respectfully by other inmates, a courtesy he attributed to his reputation preceding him. He was working as a tutor in the facility's educational program, teaching other inmates to read and manage basic financial literacy. It seemed appropriate somehow, him teaching people to build alternative versions of themselves the way my father had once taught him. When the visiting time ended, Giovanni walked me to the exit. The routine was controlled and observed, guards stationed at regular intervals, but we had those final moments. "I have a release date," he said quietly. 7 months from now. I'll be transferred to a halfway house for the final stretch, but the end of confinement is visible now. What happens after? I asked. "I don't know," Giovanni replied. "My business is gone. I liquidated most of my assets to pay restitution to victims of trafficking. I have minimal financial resources, but I have time to figure out what comes next. And I have something I didn't have before." "What's that?" "The knowledge that I can survive consequence, that I can accept punishment, and maintain integrity through it." He looked at me directly. "And the possibility of building something genuine rather than something constructed to hide what I'd been." The next 7 months unfolded with their own peculiar rhythm. I visited Giovanni monthly, our conversations deepening as the barriers between investigation and relationship dissolved. We talked about philosophy, about redemption, about the possibility of building life together when both of us had been damaged by the weight of searching for truth. We talked about my father and what he'd died trying to accomplish. We talked about the future in cautious, hopeful ways. Sarah continued her recovery work in Crescent Valley. Her trauma manifested as nightmares and anxiety, but she was working with a therapist who specialized in PTSD from kidnapping. Our relationship, fractured by years of distance and resentment, began healing through shared purpose. We took walks through the town where we'd grown up. We visited our father's grave regularly. We talked about the man he'd been, not just the sacrifice he'd made. The network that my father had attempted to expose remained partially intact despite the raids and arrests. Thomas Valence was imprisoned, his infrastructure dismantled, his associates arrested or in hiding. But criminal networks are resilient structures. New people filled the positions of those who'd been removed. New routes replaced intercepted ones. The fight against trafficking and corruption wasn't finished by the exposures we'd facilitated. It was ongoing, and would continue to be ongoing for years. I received job offers from major news outlets after the documentary released. Networks wanted investigative journalists who could handle stories of institutional corruption. I declined most of them, choosing instead to freelance and maintain editorial control over my work. I couldn't go back to being a journalist who simply reported facts without personal investment. I was too deeply embedded in the consequences now. Giovanni was released after 34 months in federal prison, which was 4 months less than his original sentence due to good behavior and time served. I waited for him outside the facility on the day of his release. He emerged carrying the few possessions he'd accumulated. A few books, some letters, the small accumulated memory of confinement. He looked older than he had when he'd entered, or perhaps just more lived in, as if the forced introspection of imprisonment had added depth to his features. "Hello," he said when he reached me, which was inadequate, but everything else seemed too large for that moment. "Hello," I replied. "Welcome back." We drove to Portland, and I'd arranged temporary housing in a modest apartment near the waterfront. Nothing like the luxury he'd lived in before, but comfortable and private. We spent the first night talking, the way people do when they're relearning each other across the distance of time and consequence. "I don't have a plan," Giovanni said. "I don't have financial resources or professional options that seem obvious. Neither of us knows what comes next," I replied. "But we can figure it out together if that's something you want." "It's something I want very much," he said simply. The following week, I drove back to Crescent Valley to collect Sarah for a planned visit to our father's grave. She'd been working with her therapist on this particular pilgrimage, understanding that returning to the cemetery was necessary psychological work. She was better but not healed, stronger but not unscathed. She'd taken leave from her teaching position and was planning to move to Portland, partially to escape the town that held too many memories, partially to be closer to me. We arrived at the cemetery in late afternoon, when the light was beginning its descent toward evening. The place was quiet in the way cemeteries always were, respectful and eternal and marked by the careful human rituals we performed around death. Our father's grave was exactly as we'd left it, his name carved into stone, his dates documenting the span of his existence. Giovanni had asked permission to come, and we'd agreed. He seemed appropriate to include. his presence in our lives now inseparable from our father's legacy. The three of us stood before the grave in silence for a long moment, each of us processing grief and completion, and the strange resolution that comes from finally finishing what someone else began. "He would have been proud," Sarah said quietly, "of what we did, of exposing what he died trying to expose. He would have been appalled at the cost," I replied, "at what we went through. He would have wanted to protect us from all of this, but he would have understood why we couldn't stop," Giovanni added. "Your father believed that some truths demanded to be known regardless of personal cost. That belief cost him his life, but it also shaped both of you. It shaped me, 15 years later. His commitment to truth resonates beyond his death." We left flowers at the grave, white roses that Sarah had selected, simple and elegant and respectful. We stood together as the sun descended and the light changed. As the cemetery transitioned from daylight to dusk, there was no dramatic moment of resolution, no supernatural sense of completion. Just three people who'd been shaped by a dead man's convictions, standing at his stone and accepting the weight of what they carried forward. The drive back to Portland took 4 hours. We stopped for dinner at a small restaurant midway, a place that served simple food and didn't make conversation difficult. Giovanni and Sarah talked about his transition back to civilian life, about the documentation project I was planning to supplement the documentary, about the fragile possibility of building something genuine rather than something constructed to hide damage. My apartment in Portland was smaller than I'd have preferred, but it was sufficient. Sarah would stay through the weekend, returning to Crescent Valley to finalize the details of her relocation. Giovanni was going to stay with me, though we both understood that was a temporary arrangement while he figured out his next steps. We spent the evening unpacking the day, talking about what the cemetery visit had meant, what it meant to have finally completed the investigation that my father had started. Over the following weeks, we settled into something that resembled domestic partnership. Giovanni worked temporary jobs while we figured out longer-term options. He'd decided he wanted to work with at-risk youth, teaching them the kind of practical financial literacy and ethics that he wished someone had provided him at 18. I continued my documentary work, began planning a book about the corruption network, maintained correspondence with federal authorities who were still working through the complexities of the cases we'd helped expose. Sarah moved to Portland in late spring. She found a teaching position at a private high school and began attending therapy weekly, work that required confronting the trauma of her kidnapping and processing the resentment she'd carried toward me for years. Our relationship was still complicated, but it was improving, becoming something based on genuine connection rather than obligation. One evening in early summer, Giovanni and I stood on the balcony of my apartment, watching the city lights reflect off the river. The night was warm, the kind of evening that made you feel alive and present and grateful for the possibility of future. "I've been thinking about what comes next," Giovanni said. "For you specifically, or for us generally?" I asked. "Both, I suppose." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to start an organization, something that provides resources to people trying to leave criminal enterprises. Education, financial support, legal assistance, the kind of intervention your father gave me." "That sounds like a good path," I said. "I think so too. I also think I want to do it with you, if you're interested. Your documentary skills, your investigative abilities, your commitment to exposing systemic corruption. We could do work that actually matters." I considered this. It would mean committing further to the trajectory that had begun with my father's death. It would mean building a life with Giovanni that wasn't based on investigation or crisis, but on shared purpose. It would mean accepting that my father's death, while tragic, had resulted in something meaningful extending into the future. "I'm interested," I said finally. We stood together as the evening deepened, two people who'd been shaped by investigation and danger and the weight of searching for truth. Sarah called later that evening from her apartment, excited about a class she was planning, sharing details about her day in the way that indicated healing was proceeding. The three of us would have dinner together the following week, a new ritual we were establishing, a small way of honoring what our father had died attempting to accomplish. The work continues. Giovanni's organization grew slowly but steadily, providing resources to people attempting to extract themselves from criminal networks. My documentary work expanded, exposing systemic corruption in multiple jurisdictions, creating pressure for institutional reform. Sarah's teaching had become more focused, working with at-risk students, providing the kind of education and mentorship that might prevent them from ending up in circumstances similar to the ones Giovanni had narrowly escaped. We never fully escaped the shadow of what my father had died investigating. Corruption remained endemic in systems designed to prevent it. Criminal networks adapted and continued. But we dismantled one specific network, exposed specific corruption, and helped specific victims access justice. It wasn't everything, but it was something. It was the inheritance my father left us. The understanding that fighting corruption was ongoing work that required commitment despite incomplete success. 1 year to the day after the federal raids that exposed the network, we returned to my father's grave. This time it was all of us. Me, Sarah, Giovanni, and even Rebecca Torres, the FBI agent who'd coordinated the federal response. We stood together at the stone, remembering, honoring, acknowledging the man whose death had set everything in motion. He would have liked this, Torres said quietly. He would have appreciated knowing that his death resulted in this kind of commitment to truth. He would have wanted to prevent all of this, Sarah corrected. He would have wanted us to be safe and unscathed and living lives that didn't require confronting trauma and corruption. But he raised us to know the difference between wanting something and accepting reality, I added. And the reality is that he died fighting for truth. And the least we can do is continue that fight. We left flowers at the grave and drove back to the city as the sun descended. The work continued. The investigation remained open in ways it would always remain open. But we were no longer haunted by the unfinished nature of what he'd started. We were participating in something that mattered, something that created ripples extending far beyond our individual circumstances. We were honoring the sacrifice he'd made by living lives committed to the truth he'd died attempting to expose. That was enough. It would have to be enough. And standing together with Sarah and Giovanni and Torres at the grave of my father, understanding that his legacy extended through all of us, I believed it actually was.